There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a review of this memoir by Beate Sirota Gordon, The Only Woman in the Room, a memoir of Japan, human rights, and the arts. What a fascinating woman Beate Sirota Gordon was. She was born in 1923 in Vienna, and she died in America, aged about 89 in 2012. She is responsible for, in other words, she herself wrote the human rights protection, specifically the women's rights clauses of the Japanese Constitution of 1946, specifically Articles 14 and 24 related to equal rights and women's civil rights. After I recorded this review, I realized that something fairly important was missing, and that is, what were these two clauses that Beate Sirota wrote? The first one is Article 14, which is about equal rights, and then Article 24, which is about women's civil rights. I will just read an excerpt. The first part of Article 14, here it is. All of the people are equal under the law, and there shall be no discrimination in political, economic, or social relations because of race, creed, sex, social status, or family origin. And then here is Article 24 in its entirety. Marriage shall be based only on the mutual consent of both sexes, and it shall be maintained through mutual cooperation with the equal rights of husband and wife as a basis. With regard to choice of spouse, property rights, inheritance, choice of domicile, divorce, and other matters pertaining to marriage and the family, laws shall be enacted from the standpoint of individual dignity and the essential equality of the sexes. And she was only 22 when she drafted that as a junior employee of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, Douglas MacArthur's occupying forces. And that is her claim to fame. But she had a fabulous, fascinating life from start to finish. I don't like memoirs. I absolutely loved this memoir. There's a lot of information, fascinating stuff about her family. Her father, Leo Sirota, was a world-renowned pianist, born in the Ukraine, fled anti-Semitism in the Ukraine to Vienna, but also to avail himself of the tremendous opportunities to perform and teach and hobnob with all the famous composers and pianists in Europe. Just a fascinating man in its own right. His wife, Augustine Sirota, was fascinating, and one of the many things that I loved about this was the matter-of-factness with which Beate kept dropping these, not salacious, but just fascinating, colorful aspects of her family history. So, for example, her mother divorced her first husband and, to quote Beate directly, abandoned her son from that marriage, never to see him again, to be with Leo. And again, just matter-of-factly explained, not delved into, left me hungering for more information. But this memoir is peppered with little things like that just kept me turning the pages. They ended up in Japan in 1929. The family, in other words, Leo and his wife and their 5 or 6-year-old daughter, Beate, were going on a cross-country concert tour of Japan, and the anti-Semitism and all the dark stuff happening in Austria escalated, and they decided not to go back, and they were offered a whole bunch of fabulous opportunities to stay in Japan, teach in Japan, give concerts. And so they settled in Tokyo, and Tokyo is where Beate Sirota grew up from the age of 6. Just fascinating description of her childhood here. She went to a German school, which once it was taken over by the Nazis was not a very safe place for her to be as a Jewish Austrian student. So she changed to the American school, all kinds of stuff, things she observed about Japanese culture. Just, I don't have time to go into it all, but you will be delighted by all that detail. And then leaves Japan in 1939 to go to a women's college in California. Her parents visit her once 2 years later, and luckily or unluckily happened to get on the last flight out of America for Japan before Pearl Harbor, and then contact was severed. So there she was maybe 18, separated from her parents, no way of contacting them during the war years while she was studying and demonstrating this incredible aptitude for language and worrying about her parents. She got involved in translating for the government, Japanese radio and news, and she would always be listening for news of her parents. Did research, fact-checking work for Time magazine, and as soon as the war was over, she applied for a job with Douglas MacArthur's occupying force. SCAP, I don't know how you pronounce it, the initialism, the acronym, and because of her Japanese language skills, she spoke 6 languages fluently. She got the job, and the main reason that she wanted the job was to get back to Tokyo to find her parents. She had finally gotten word just after the war. I think it was one of her Time magazine colleagues who was over there, that they were safe. So that's the main reason she wanted the job. She got the job, came to Japan, found her parents. They were almost starved to death. Helped them get back to health, and started her work with the occupying forces in Tokyo. The stuff about the Constitution, I'm not going to get into it. It's fascinatingly detailed, but basically, in a nutshell, MacArthur gave women the vote. And he was adamant that Japanese women needed to vote in terms of his agenda for one reason and one reason only. Japanese women don't like war, and he didn't want Japan making any more wars, so we're going to give Japanese women the vote, and that takes care of that problem, and he was largely right. If you know one thing about the Japanese Constitution, you know that Article 9 stipulates that Japan shall never make war again, and it is the most popular provision in any constitution in the world, I would say. I don't think the Japanese citizenry will ever consent to it being changed. And primarily, that would be the opinion of women, but not only women. He gave the post-war new Japanese government a chance to draft a new constitution, because the old one, it wasn't quite feudal, but it was almost feudal. It dated back to the Meiji era from the 1880s. A horrifically conservative constitution for the 1940s. The Japanese government's drafts barely moved off of that patriarchal BS of the Meiji Constitution. So he said, fine, you guys aren't going to draft one that I like. I'm going to draft one, and you're going to accept it. And so he gave his staff a week to come up with a new constitution. Beate Sirota was dragged into that project because she was a woman. They said, you're a woman, you can write the women's rights and human rights section. So she did. And that is how she came to exert such a profound impact on Japanese society. There's all kinds of details about that week-long, incredibly harried series of all-nighter draftings of the Constitution. You can read that for yourself. But she was also pulled into the meetings between the occupying forces and the Japanese government to act as an interpreter. Her language ability was just phenomenal. But nobody revealed that she had written this part of the Constitution. Well, the Japanese government was not happy with this very progressive Constitution and pushed back as much as they could, but they realized, I think MacArthur basically threatened them, well, if you don't like what we've done, I'm just going to abolish your emperor. How would you like that? And they didn't want that, so they caved. But nobody revealed that the only woman in the room during that historic meeting, Beate Sirota, had written the women's rights section. She herself didn't reveal that she had authored those provisions until the first edition of this book was published. There's so much more detail. After the war, she and her parents separately go to America. Her life after that continued to be absolutely fascinating. I've said enough, I hope, to whet your appetite. But what an incredible woman. Incredibly talented. She writes, again, very matter-of-factly, but revealingly about the sexism she encountered in America, in Japan, and about the situation for Japanese women that she observed as a child, always walking one step behind the husband, usually having dinner in the kitchen while their husbands ate their meal in the dining room, and just countless inane, ridiculous, outrageous things like that. And so she knew what she was writing this part of the Constitution to address, and it's a very debatable fact whether it made a great deal of difference, but it certainly didn't hurt to have those provisions in the Constitution. She doesn't address how much of an impact or how little of an impact they had. There's scholarship out there and books have been written about it, and I am interested in reading them, but I can't knowledgeably comment. I would just say, having lived in Japan for a dozen years myself, that, boy, the situation for women in Japan is probably somewhat similar to what it was for women in North America in the 1960s. So yeah, it's pretty backwards in terms of gender equality, but it would be even more backwards. For example, let me close by sharing with you something that was from a manual on family life that was curricula, I think maybe teacher training in the Department of Education in 1944, so before the end of the war. This was what was to be taught and instilled about the family. The Lord is the head and the subject is the tail. The father is the head and the child is the tail. Continuing the same logic, the husband is the head and the wife the tail. Therefore, the husband is noble and the wife is humble. For the wife, her husband is the heaven. One cannot escape from heaven. As one is always under heaven, the wife is always under the authority of her husband wherever she may be. Without her obedience to the husband, there is no happiness nor honor for her. So that wasn't coming from the Japanese Constitution pre-World War II, but it was reflecting the prevailing views of womanhood. The fact that the provisions about human rights and specifically women's rights made it into the 1946 Constitution certainly went some distance from moving Japan past those archaic, deeply offensive views, but there's still a lot more that has to be done. We can't fault Beate Sirota Gordon for that. She did her part, which was no small part, and she was one of the most fascinating women of the 20th century. I recommend this to you very highly. Thanks for watching.